Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everyone. As Dan said, today I'm going to be talking about SQL Server security mistakes that everyone makes. Um, so for this session, I'm not going to be talking about the stuff you talk about all the time, like don't set trustworthy or be sure to use security groups and not individual people. I'm going to be talking about some things that uh, a lot of people may not even realize is an issue, things you don't really hear talked about very much. I do have a slide in here about me, but that would be pretty boring if I just sat here and talked about me. Um, I'm not going to say much about myself. I am a certified master and an MVP, and as Dan said, I help run the Past Security virtual chapter. But if you really want to be bored, you can't fall asleep, download the slide deck and you can read the notes section and read all about me. So the first thing I'd like to talk about with today's session is something I've done millions of times in the past. I'm sure all of you have done it or are currently doing it pretty much every day. Anytime you need to delete a login, um, how many of us really think about, oh, I should go into each database they had a user in and delete the user in the database as well? I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, if the login is deleted, they can't access the database, right? But once a user logs into SQL Server, they actually get all the permissions that are available to them. I like to refer to this as a permission superset. So this includes any permissions that they have granted through group membership. It also includes any orphaned users that are in the database. So even though it may be a completely different user, and that user doesn't have a login, if that user exists in the database and that person gets access to log in through some other group or some other path, they still get those rights that were granted to that user in the database. And there is a handy tool that I use to see all login paths that a user has. There's a system extended procedure called XP Login Info. You can pass in the Windows account and the second parameter of all, and it'll tell you every path through which they have the ability to log into SQL Server. And we're going to take a look at this with a quick demo. So for my first demo here, I'm going to need to create a couple of groups in my local. This would be an amalgamous to creating them in AD if I was on an enterprise or in a domain. But I'm just working on my laptop, so I'm going to create them in my local users and groups on my laptop, and I'm going to do this from the command line. It's actually very easy, assuming you have permissions to do it. So I'm going to open up a command prompt as administrator. So right-click on that, click Run as Administrator, and then I can just use these net commands that I'm going to copy right here from the comments in this code. So first I'm going to create a user called SQL Test 1, and it'll have a password of capital P, lowercase a, $, capital W, 0RD. And then the final argument there, slash, says add this to the users group. And so now I have a user by the name, and I can actually query to verify that user is in there just by saying net user SQL test 1. And it gives me all the information that it has for that user, when the password was last set, when the password expires. And this is very handy for when users are complaining to you that they can no longer get into SQL Server and you suspect that maybe their password has expired. You can just pull this up real quick. You can see whether or not their password is valid and tell immediately. And you can see local group memberships is in the users group. Any user you create will be in the users group automatically. So now I want to create a couple of security groups. So I'm going to create a couple of Windows groups using net local group. So first I'd say just net local group and then the name of the group. In this case it'll be SQL testers and say it had. So it's going to create a group with this name. And then I'm going to add SQL test 1 to that group. So by simply adding the username as an argument to that previous command, it now will add that user to the group. And I'm going to create another group called SQL Dev. And then I'm going to add SQL Test 1 to that group as well. So now SQL Test 1 is now in both of these groups. And again, I can just do net user SQL Test 1 to see the information. And now we can see here under local group memberships, the SQL Test 1 is now also a member of SQL Dev and SQL Testers. So now we have these groups to work with here. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to create a login for the two groups, SQL Testers and SQL Dev. I'm not going to create SQL Test 1. And now I'm going to switch to the AdventureWorks 2016 database. And I'm going to create users for both of those logins so that they both have a user in that database. Now that the users are in the database, I'm going to add SQL testers to the DB data writer role, which is going to give them permissions to write to any of the tables in the database. So it'll give them insert, update, and delete permissions. Then I'm going to add SQL Dev to the data reader role, which will give it permissions to select from any table. So we can verify by querying sys.server principals that the SQL Test 1 login doesn't exist. It returns no roles. So just showing that I did not create a login for the user themselves. Now using the XP login info I mentioned, I can pass in SQL Test 1 with the second parameter of all to see all of its login paths. That returns me two rows showing how it can log in. So it can log in because SQL Dev has the ability to log in, or it can log in because SQL Testers has the ability to log in. So those are the two permission paths it gets. This means that when SQL Test logs in, they get the superset of those permissions, so they get all the permissions granted to SQL Dev and all the permissions granted to SQL Testers. Just to show, using the suser sname function, I can show right now, currently I'm logged in as myself using my Microsoft account. But for the next part of this demo, I'm going to use execute as to do some operations as SQL Test 1. So I'm using execute as login SQL Test 1. So I'm able to do stuff as this user. You use that suser sname function again to show that as far as SQL Server is concerned at this moment, I am SQL Test 1 and not myself. And I can use the has perms by name function just to see, what permissions I have. SQL Test 1 is a member of SQL Dev, which has select permissions on all the tables. So I'll just say, okay, do I have permissions to select from dbo.errorlog? And it returns a 1, which means yes. A 0 would mean no. And because SQL Test 1 is a member of SQL Testers, I should have insert, update, and delete permissions. And I get a 1 for each of those. So yes, of course, got everything granted to SQL Dev and SQL Testers. Now I'm going to switch back to myself real quick. So now I'm executing as myself again. I'm going to jump back into the master database, and I'm going to drop both of those group logins. So now SQL testers and SQL dev no longer have logins. However, I did not delete the users from the databases, so the users still exist in the database. Now I'm going to create a login specifically for SQL Test 1. Now, all I've done is create a login for SQL Test 1. I've granted it no permissions whatsoever in any database or at the server level. So the only permission, if we were to go query permissions, the only permission it currently has as SQL Test 1 is connect to SQL Server or log in. So I'm going to switch back to the SQL Test 1 user, use an execute as, and just prove that I'm executing as SQL Test 1. Yes, it sees me, I'm SQL Test 1. So if SQL Test 1 has no permissions granted to it, I shouldn't be able to switch into the AdventureWorks 2016 database because SQL Test 1 wasn't granted any permissions there. But of course, I have no problems doing that. And what about the permissions I had before? Insert, update, delete, and select. And yes, of course, I get a 1 for all 4 of those. SQL Test 1 still has all those perms in the database because those database users still exist. So I'm going to switch back to myself. One little caveat about when you use execute as in revert to go back to yourself, if you change database as the other user, you have to switch back to the original database. To revert, you have to be in the same database you were in when you used execute as. So that's why I'm switching to master before I do the revert. So now I'm back as myself again. And so let's look at the XP login info for SQL Test 1. We look at it, all we see is the only login path it has is as itself. Those groups have no login. So it can't log into SQL Server using those group memberships, but it still gets those permissions once it gets into SQL Server. So that's one of the reasons it's really important that you delete those users, is because it's very hard for you to tell unless you go into the database and test what permissions they have to know whether or not they're actually getting extra permissions than what you think they are.
Excuse me, Robert.
So now I'm going to, yeah.
Robert, I had one question came in. What if you disable the login and user?
So if you disable the login, it will operate pretty much the same way as if you drop the login. The user won't be able to log in, but if they still have the user in the database is still active, they'll still have the ability to get those permissions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. If you disable the user in the database, then they won't be able to get any permissions from it. So continuing on, I'm going to drop the login for SQL Test 1. And if I run XP login info now, it returns absolutely no records. SQL Test 1 has no way at all to log into this database. So you think, okay, so I'm safe now. SQL Test 1 has absolutely no path to log in. So SQL Test 1 can't get any permissions. And just proving that it's still SQL Test 1 that's logged in. And, oh, actually that's myself. I skipped a line. So I use execute as, so I'm going to try to execute as SQL Test 1 again and see what happens. I get no errors. So okay. And if I run the test to see, it says I'm executing a SQL Test 1. Like, well, how can I be executing a SQL test 1 when SQL test 1 can't log in? Well, I can log in, and all removing a login does is remove their ability to log in. Since I'm already logged in, I don't have to go through that check. I can impersonate SQL test 1. So if you have users with the ability to impersonate other users, that user can impersonate SQL test 1 and get any permissions that SQL test 1 has. So just to show that I can do the things that I can still do all the things that SQL test 1 has permissions through those users, just do a select from the database log in AdventureWorks 2016, and absolutely, I've got those permissions that SQL test 1 was granted via the group memberships. Even though there are no logins for any of the two groups or the user, I can still impersonate SQL test 1 and get all of SQL test 1's permissions. And now I'm just going to revert back to myself. So I'm going to jump back into the slide deck here.
Robert, I'm sorry, one final question.
Yes.
If the user is mapped to only one Windows login, would there still be an issue like the one in the demo?
Well, if they have no other login paths at all, you still have the issue of somebody being able to impersonate them and get their permissions. And you also, and this really becomes a big issue if you do things like back up a database and move it to another environment. Like, for example, I've seen people will deploy a new database from development to production, and so they'll back it up in dev, where the developers may have really wide permissions, restore it in production, and without even realizing it, because the developer can log in thinking that all they're going to get is read-only permissions, because those users still exist with those permissions defined in the database. They get in there and they find out, usually through some unfortunate accident, that they do still have very high-level permissions and can delete stuff and drop stuff. So there are cases, I mean, definitely, there's times where leaving the orphan database and the orphan user in the database isn't going to cause a problem. But I think the potential for problem to occur is serious enough that it's something we should stop doing, and we should always go through and delete those users when we delete a login. The easiest way I found to do it is, of course, delete the users first when you can look at the login and see what databases they're in. Go through each of those databases and delete the users, and then delete the login. So moving on to the second thing, the other mistake that I see people making all the time is allowing non-admin users to have database owner permissions. And I see this pretty widespread when you have people that you want them to be able to update tables and do things like that in the database. And so the easy answer is, okay, we'll just give them DB owner, then they can change whatever they need to, and we don't have to worry about specifying what permissions or specifying any particular objects or anything. Doing it the way I did with by putting someone into the data writer group or and the data reader group is just as easy as putting them in a DB owner group, and it doesn't give them other permissions that they don't need. So there are two ways you can get database owner groups. You can actually be the actual owner of the database, or a member of the DB owner group within the database. And we'll go into explain that difference a little bit more in a bit. And as said before, the user gets all possible database permissions if they are a database owner, even potentially harmful permissions. Like they can drop objects, they can change database settings like recovery model or the compatibility level, um, things that can really break how stuff works in your system. They can modify, add, and drop the database files. They can change them so that they can't grow. They can add additional files, things like that. They can create out-of-band backups. This is one that can really hurt you. Somebody creates a backup to a share that they've created because they want to say, oh, I want a backup on my laptop. So they create a backup to a share that they own, and the database administrator has no idea that they've done this. It's completely reset the log, make changes to the log chain, and then when they go to do a restore, they find out that none of the differentials that they've taken after this backup that the user created can be restored to the last full backup that they have. So they end up having to restore days and days and days and days of worth of log files instead. And instead of being a very fast restore, it's now a restore that takes many hours or even longer. And some of these changes can actually break your log chain, like if they were to change the recovery model on database settings, suddenly your log backups will start failing, and your log chain will no longer be intact. You'll have to, once you find out what happened, you'll have to change, and you change the setting back, you'll have to start over with a new full database to get the log chain restarted. And it can really create a lot of headache for the database administrator. And then, of course, they can also just drop the database. I mean, I'm sure none of us want users to be able to inadvertently drop the database, because then we're going to have to go and restore the latest version, and who knows, may have been 5, 10, 15, however many minutes since the last backup. If you were doing log backups, it could be hours if you were doing just like a daily full. So we're talking about potential data loss as the result of an action completely out of your hand. So let's do a quick demo of some of this. So I'm going to start off by creating a login for SQL Test 1 again. We're using the same user we created in the first demo. I'm going to give it permissions to create any database on the server. So SQL Test 1 will be able to create a database on its own. And then now I'm going to switch the context to SQL Test 1 using an execute as. And then I'm going to create a database called SQL Test 1 owns. And if I come over to Object Explorer and refresh the databases node, we can see that there's now a SQL Test 1 owns database. And if I look at the properties of it, we can see owner is SQL Test 1. So SQL Test 1 is the owner of this database. When you create or restore a database, you are automatically made the owner of that database. There's a very good reason they do this way. I mean, if you create a database, they're assuming you're going to then need to do stuff inside that database. And the easiest way to give you whatever permissions you need to do inside the database is to make you the owner of it, because it gives you DB owner permissions. So you can then go in, create users and do stuff like that and whatever you need to do. So now that the database is created, I'm going to switch to that database. And I'm just going to run this real quick query to see who is listed as the owner of the database. Now, the way you can see who owns the database is the SID of the person who created it is stored in sys.databases in a column called owner SID. So you join to sys.server principals, you join owner SID to SID. And I'm going to limit it to just the database that I'm in. And so database name SQL Test 1 owns is owned by SQL Test 1. So this means SQL Test 1 is all perms inside the database. And I can prove it. I'm going to create a new table called DBO All Objects just by selecting into it from sys.allObjects. So I've selected from system tables, created a new table in there called dbo.allObjects, which we can see here. I can query the table I just created. So no problem. I've got full DB owner permissions. But what other things can I do that you may not expect me to be able to do? Can I change the recovery model? Absolutely, no problem. It's now running in simple recovery model. And if this was a production database and I was taking log backups, the DB would start receiving failure notices about log backups failing because you can't back up a database in simple recovery model. I can set the page verification method to none. Great. So now if we get corruption, it won't be detected until that corrupt page is actually read and the read fails. So now anything new created in the database won't be protected against easy corruption verification. I can turn on some unfavorable options like auto shrink and auto close. Sure, no problem. I can do all kinds of damage to the database. I can change the log file, set file growth to 0 so that it's no longer able to grow. And then when if the log file gets full, it'll just start throwing error messages and queries will fail instead of growing. I can add a new log file. So oops, I didn't want file growth to be 0. So let me add a new log file. So now the database has 2 log files, one that can't grow and one that can. Or and I can also remove any extra files that exist in the database. So as database owner, I've got all kinds of potentially harmful permissions, things that you don't want people to have simply because they need to be able to update data in tables. So let's try some other stuff. How about enabling containment? In this case, setting containment failed, and the error message says that the contained database authentication configuration option has to be enabled at the server level before you can enable this at the database level. So let's pretend, let's say we did have a contained database on this database that was legitimate. And so in a new window here, just as myself, I'm going to enable contained database authentication. And so now coming back here again as SP1 or as SQL Test 1, if I try to enable it now, nope, couldn't get it locked because I've got it open over here. Let's try that again. It does have to be able to get it locked to do this. Let me see, I may need to close that then. Get that out of the database. That's in master. Okay. Should be able to get there. Once I switched everything, it was able to get the lock, and now containment is enabled in the database without my knowledge of it ever occurring. So now let's say as the DBA, say we've deleted the one database where we knew there was containment, and we want to now disable contained databases. So I'm going to run this in another window as myself to disable containment. And now I, the DBA, am getting error messages saying I can't disable contained database authentication because there's a database that uses it. Now, there is a way to bypass this. If I wanted to, instead of using reconfigure, I can use reconfigure with override. And that would force the disabling of this setting. It would force this setting to be set to what I set it to, despite the fact that there being a database with that is contained. And in this case, if I were to do this, contained authentication would then start to fail in the database. So even though the setting would still be enabled in the database, no contained users would be able to log into the database. So what are some of the other things? Can it set trustworthy on? No, fortunately it can't do that. Setting trustworthy on requires that you be a sysadmin. So that's one of the few things that a database owner can't do. So there are some limitations to what they can do, but not very many. Now I'm going to revert back to myself. I'm going to drop the login for SQL Test 1. Make sure the revert worked. Oh, yeah, it's not, and it won't allow me to drop the login because it owns a database. So that's one of the other things that can tie you up if you decide you want to delete that user. You can't. I can still delete that user from the users group, though. By using the net user command, telling it to delete. Let me clear that up there so it's easier to see. Say net user SQL test 1 and the parameter is delete instead of add. And the user no longer exists. And if I were to then try the XP login for SQL test 1, because the user has been deleted from AD, I actually get an error saying that it couldn't find that NT group or user in AD. So now, since we saw before I couldn't drop the login because it owned the database, I can now drop the database if I wanted to. I could drop the database, and I could then, because the database no longer existed, I could disable containment. So let's go back to the slide deck. So there's one other thing I want to cover today, and it's very closely related to what we just covered with database owner, and that's leaving a real user as the database owner. Even if they absolutely do need database owner permissions, you shouldn't leave them as the owner of the database. You should make them a real user in the database, and then added them to that DB owner group. As I said before, you can see who the owner of the database is by looking at the owner SID column in sys.databases. And I do have a query. This query is included in the session demo file, so you'll be able to download this with a slide deck that will give you the information and show you who the owner of the database is. Now, there's two different ways you can get that information. So for the do a left join to sys databases of sys.server principals. And if a login exists for that user, then you'll see the name being pulled from sys.server principals as the DB owner login. However, as you saw in the first example, SQL test 1 had been granted permissions to access via group. So like a DBA like myself, my permissions to be a sysadmin on my server is going to be through the DBA security group and not myself directly. However, the security, if I restore a database or create a new database, it will have my personal individual SID listed as the owner of the database and not the SID of the group I belong to. It actually links it directly to the SID of the member of the group as opposed to the group. So in that case, there's the function suser sname. You can pass it a SID, and it will actually look it up in AD to see if it can find that SID and report that account. So if the user exists in AD and is a specific login, then you'll see both the values for DB owner login and DB owner Windows account being returned as the same thing. If the person has their permissions through a group, DB owner login will be null, and it'll have a value returned as DB owner Windows account. If there is no login and the SID no longer exists in AD, then both of those columns will be null. And so when both of those columns are null, that's when you have an invalid owner of a database. And your first thought might be, well, what does that matter? Because, you know, if the owner isn't a real person, then nobody's going to get those permissions, right? So the owner of the database, their account, their login, their account gets mapped to the database user role DBO. So within every database there's a user called DBO, and whatever that login is that owns the database, it gets mapped directly to that user. DBO bypasses permissions checking within the database. So if you are the DBO user, meaning you login map to that, you're the owner of the database. Anything you do within the database, it doesn't even do permissions checking. So, oh, you're DBO, I know you can do anything. Which is why, if you ever try to deny access to a sysadmin or to a database owner, you'll find that it doesn't work, because that DBO bypasses permissions checking, and sysadmins within the context of the database simply impersonate the DBO. So at the database level, we look exactly the same as the owner of the database. It can tell no difference between us and them. So we completely bypass permissions checking. So if you have an invalid owner, it can cause error 916 when the sysadmin tries to access the database. I'm sure some of you out there have experienced this. You try to do something in a database, like view the properties or make a change to a database, and you get a weird error saying that you can't do that in your current context. The actual text of the error is the server principal, and then we'll say your login, is not able to access the database, name of the database, under the current security context. Now, if I'm a sysadmin and I'm getting this error, absolutely the first thing I check is, does that database have a valid owner? Chance, this isn't the only thing that can cause that error, but this is absolutely a key reason, a key cause of this error, and the first thing that I check. So if you let some user be that database owner and then they leave the company and their login no longer exists in AD, even though the login hasn't been deleted in SQL Server, or the group that they have had access through is still in SQL Server, they now have an invalid owner, and you may start seeing errors like this. And this isn't something that you can readily reproduce for like a demo, because it relies on a lot of things like login tokens and cache and things like that. So there's no guarantee how long it will take before these errors start popping up after the user is deleted from AD. It'll depend on when the login token gets deleted from cache. I would like to show you, though, in action, and I specifically did not delete database SQL test 1 owns yet, because I wanted to show you the query that I had pictured up on the screen, and as I said, this will be included with the download of the slide deck and demo code. So if I run this, I can see for most of my databases are owned by SA. One of them is owned by me specifically, and so is this one. So 2 of them are owned by me, and SQL Test 1 is owned by SQL Test 1. So the login hasn't been deleted, so it's still there, and then S user S name still returns a valid account. So this query, you can see easily that if it shows you something in these columns, it doesn't matter what it is, you can see that it has currently a valid owner. These 3 that aren't for SA, because they are tied specifically to users, have the potential to be become invalid users if those users are ever deleted. Now we saw that in this case I did delete SQL Test 1 from AD, so it no longer exists in AD anymore, but the function to look up the SID still returns the valid user for it, because the token is still in cache. SQL Server will cache login tokens for a period of time. So until that token is actually removed from SQL Server's cache, this function will actually return that saying, oh yeah, everything's good. And you won't start getting these errors as long as it's still able to look up the SID and get a valid response. But maybe a day from now, I may start seeing errors start popping up from time to time. Anytime it tries to validate that DBO user to see if it's really to validate who it is, you'll get that weird error saying that you can't use the current security context.
Hey, Robert, I got a couple quick questions.
Okay.
The first is, do you suggest that a best practice is to make database owner SA instead of an actual user?
Now that's a highly debated topic. I typically will use SA. There are some security holes, which I don't go into in this session, but I have gone into other sessions, where if SA is the owner of the database and the database is enabled for trustworthy, a database owner can impersonate the SA user and gain access to other databases. That will only work if trustworthy is enabled on the database. As a rule, I never allow trustworthy to be enabled on databases. All the reasons that people want to enable trustworthy, there is a valid workaround for how to do what they want to do without enabling trustworthy. Usually it involves using certificates to sign procedures or assembly code if they want to enable it for or assemblies. So as long as you never enable trustworthy, SA is perfectly fine. And it's what I always use because I absolutely do not allow trustworthy to ever be enabled on any database. But if someone ever does enable trustworthy, it does open up a security hole. So a lot of people will advocate that rather than making the owner a real person or the SA account, that you create within SQL Server a low privileged account and make that account the owner of the database. So you don't grant it any permissions at the server level of database. You just create an account, let that account be the owner of the database, and absolutely nothing else. And in this case, you would probably want to create, to ensure that nobody can impersonate that account to get access to a different database. You would want to use a different account for each database. That can get pretty tedious if you have a lot of databases. So it's simpler just to say, nope, I don't allow trustworthy, and just set SA to be the owner of all the databases.
Thank you. If mixed mode is not enabled, can you still have SA be the owner?
Yes. And then this all goes back to and this is true also if the SA, even if whether mixed mode is enabled or not, or whether the SA account is enabled or not. You'll see a lot of advice that says to disable the SA account, whether you use mixed mode or not. And that's one thing I always do. I disable the SA account. Never use it for anything. But it can be the owner of jobs and databases and everything within SQL. Because much like deleting a login, disabling a login, all it does is prevent someone from logging in as that account. So SA can still, it can still be used to run stuff. It can be impersonated. It can be set as the owner of the databases or owner of a job. So absolutely, it can be in Windows auth only. It can be disabled and still own your databases.
Great, thank you. I have one last one, and then I'll let you get on. Is there a way to manually force that security token or all security tokens from cache?
There's no way to force security tokens on external bodies to be purged, but it's very easy on the SQL Server itself, and there's a very good reason why I don't do it for this for the demonstrations here, and that's to reboot the server. If you reboot the server, anything that's in cache gets cleared out. Unfortunately, just rebooting SQL Server isn't enough. You would need to actually reboot the server. And that will clear out anything that's in cache. Oops, that one should have been deleted. And actually, that does bring us to the end. And even though I think we've covered all the questions, but we're at the Q&A part anyway. Any last questions, Dan?
None coming in yet.
Okay. Of course, if you have one right now, feel free to type it in. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for attending. If you come up with a question later, my recommendation would be to either hit me up on Twitter at SQL Soldier, or you can contact me through my blog, SQLSoldier.com. You can email me at SQLSoldier@SQLSoldier.com. So very easy to remember. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Robert, for presenting today. We definitely appreciate it. We hope to have the session uploaded to the website in a day or so, and hope also to see everyone again in early April, where we will have VMware, SQL Server, and encrypting private data. Thank you very much.
Thank you.